Dr. MacDonald, I am filling in some big shoes here. Megan Lewis, who's the host of the YouTube channel Digital Hammurabi, and of course, she's also the co-host with Bart Ehrman on his podcast. She is not able to make it. So I am in her shoes here to ask you some questions pertaining to your work, your course, your book, which is related to the course, and of course, everything that you've done up to this point with your new book on her behalf. And so I hope you'll give me a little bit of time.
Sure, of course.
Thank you. Thank you. First question she has, and I think it's a necessary one for most people in the world. She says, Dr. MacDonald, you're one of the first scholars to use Mimesis Criticism to better understand the New Testament Gospels. Can you tell us exactly what Memetic criticism or Mimesis criticism is?
Mimesis criticism is simply a methodology that has a certain discipline to it to assess how one book imitates another. Mimesis is the Greek word for imitation. It was taught in schools so that people would learn how to write by using venerated models. And the model that was most often used for narrative were the Homeric epics. Even though they were written in archaic Greek and were a devil for students to read and to model their own work after, it was the cultural definition of what it meant to be Greek. And so people would shape their own narratives over against the Homeric epic or the other models in order to learn how to compose. And they did so in the context of the valorization of the memory of the Greeks. So it had to do with cultural identity. An example of mimesis that's probably best known is Virgil's Aeneid, in rewriting the Homeric epics in order to give structure to the mythologies of Rome under Augustus. Mimesis criticism has 7 criteria that are important for taking the subjectivity out of the comparison of texts. One is the targeted text or the antitext available? And the Homeric epics were everywhere in Greek culture, so there's no debate about that. The second criterion is analogy. Did other people imitate these stories? And again, in schools, people were told how to imitate these stories, often in order to make one character better than another. I'll talk about that later. It's called syncresis. Criteria 3, 4, and 5 have to do with the glue that attaches the antitext to the hypertext, that is the later imitation. One is order, is density. How many parallels do you find between the two texts? Is it just one, or is it a cluster? Do these multiple imitations or similarities appear in the same sequence, or are they randomized? If they're more in a sequence, it's more likely you have an imitation. Also, distinctive traits. Sometimes authors flag that they are rewriting the antitext, but almost always you can see why an author would like to compare these stories. And so they tell the reader, look, this is an alternative to the Homeric tale or whatever. Then the 6th criterion is interpretability. Why would one author rewrite an antecedent? And often this is competitive. The Greek word for it is zelos or zelusis, where we get the word zealot, that it's a rivalry, it's a struggle. But in rhetorical terms, it also is sometimes called syncresis. It's a comparison of one character with another to show the superiority of the the leader of your group over against the leader of another. So we see this in the New Testament, of course, with Jesus being like but superior to Elijah or Elisha or David or Moses. But you find it also in Greek mythology, that Jesus is superior to the likes of Odysseus or Hector or Achilles. And then the final criterion is ancient recognition. Did the readers who read these texts of the Gospels, let's say, or Acts, recognize the similarities with the Greek authors? And in many cases, they did. This is especially true of the Gospel of John, where Jesus is the new Dionysus. He changes water into wine, provides water for the Samaritan woman out in the wild, and yada, yada. I mean, it goes on and on. But many people, many readers saw the similarities between the Johannine Jesus and Dionysus, and this includes Clement of Alexandria. And we're not embarrassed by those similarities, because they're not saying Jesus is a new Dionysus. He's better than Dionysus. So that's what Mimesis criticism is.
Yeah, and there's so much to explore there. Her next question is, why do you think it's such an underexplored area in biblical studies?
Well, first of all, I think there's just a widespread ignorance of Greek poetry. That was true for me when I went to graduate school. The only Homer that I had read before I went to Harvard to study classics and the New Testament was what I read about a few tales of the Odyssey when I was in high school. I'd never read the Iliad and so on. So there's widespread cultural ignorance of the Homeric epics, whereas in antiquity, the Homeric epics were everywhere. As Hegel said, Homer was the oxygen that Greeks breathed. It was everywhere. So we have cultural ignorance, but also the Guild of New Testament Scholarship has been oriented toward Jewish backgrounds. It's been, therefore, for example, the dominant Greek text we use as scholars for the New Testament has about 3,000 cross-references to the Jewish Bible and only 5 to poetry, none to Virgil, none to Homer, 1 to Euripides, and it's outrageous. So to give you an example, we have catalogs of literary papyri from Egypt from 200 BCE to 200 CE. And we have 5 fragments of the Jewish Bible in the Septuagint. We have over 600 fragments of Homer. Now, you tell me what is more likely to be the literary competence of New Testament readers. The books they knew were predominantly Greek poetry.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. She has another good question, and that is, does Mimesis criticism suggest a direct knowledge of specific Greek and Roman poetic texts on the part of the authors of the New Testament, Gospels, or more that they were written by people with a more general knowledge of the genre?
Actually, that is a good question, Megan. And I think it's not an either or. I think in some cases, it's the author can trade on general knowledge of Homeric epics. I call this Homeric radiation in the culture. In other cases, it looks that the author has a visual access to a particular text because of the sequencing and the vocabulary and so on. But there's another thing I want you to think about, Megan. Quintilian says to his students when they're going to imitate something, that they should read the model that they want to imitate over and over and over again so that they can digest it. And the image that sometimes is used is like a cow grazing in the field and then calling that up to for its cud to to re-eat it and then to digest it and to make milk. Or another example is a bee that gathers honey from various flowers and then digests it in such a way as to create honey. So Quintilian says, okay, if you want to write a story about a shipwreck, what you ought to do is read Odyssey 5 over and over and over again so that you can digest it. So that when you go to compose, you're not necessarily looking at a copy of Odyssey 5. But you've so digested it that when you write your own version of it, you can imitate it after having digested it for yourself, or you can also use it eclectically. You can the story of something from the Bible, and you can do that too. But that form of rewriting is still writing from a text. It's just that it's not a visual access to the text at the moment you're composing, but it's a mnemonic, that is, you memorize much of the text by having read it over and over again. So when you write it, you don't have to have immediate access to the text. And you certainly can't expect your readers to have direct access to the text. So for them, it is going to be cultural radiation. So that's a great question, Megan. And we still are at relatively early stages of understanding how mimesis and rhetoric and composition works.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you give an example of a parallel between a piece of classical poetry and one of the New Testament Gospels?
Well, one of my favorites is the story of Polyphemus and Circe and the Gerasene demoniac. To remind you, Megan, of the story of Polyphemus, Odysseus and his 12 men put their ship moor their ship at an island. They find a caveman whom nobody can subdue. They go into his cave unwittingly, and then the Cyclops returns. He puts a big stone over the door of the tomb, starts eating Odysseus's men. They want to kill him, but if they do so, they can't escape because only he can remove the doorstone. It's so huge. So they blind his eye. Then Polyphemus, to get his sheep out, pulls the door open, tries to keep the men from escaping, but they're tied to the bottom of the sheep and they escape, and so on. The Circe story is Odysseus again goes to an island. There he finds a witch who's a cannibal, and she turns his soldiers into swine. Later, he rescues them, but later in the epic, all these people who had been swine are drowned in the sea. Well, with the Gerasene demoniac, Jesus and his 12 disciples sail to the shore of an island or whatever, and they encounter a caveman whom nobody can subdue. By the way, I didn't mention the trading of names in the Odyssey. Odysseus claims that he's nobody, 𝀭, and in the Gerasene demoniac story, the demoniac says that they are legion. Then Jesus pulls a stunt like Circe. He turns the demons, the legion of demons, that is soldiers, into swine, and then drowns them. And the parallels actually go on and on. I could give you more examples of it. But when Byzantine intellectuals rewrote the story of the Gerasene demoniac, they used the first 11 lines of the introduction of the Polyphemus story without changing them. So these readers recognize these similarities. So what we can, let's run through our criteria. Was the Odyssey available to to the author of the Gospel of Mark and his readers? Yes. Did other people imitate? Yes. Both Polyphemus and Circe have appearances in Virgil's Aeneid, for example. What about the density and sequence and distinctive traits in these stories? Yes, they're all over the place. Now, what about the interpretability? Oh, well, who would you like better? Odysseus, who blinds this fellow, steals his sheep, and gloats about it, or Jesus, who changes this caveman into a sane person and clothes him, and it says, "Go and say what God has done for you." Whereas Odysseus called back and say, "Go tell everybody how I have blinded you." So you have that syncresis. And then you have the ancient recognition. These poets of the Byzantine poets saw the similarities. Come on. Now, why can't scholars today see them? Because we don't know Homer in the same way. And we are in a discipline that has been studiously avoiding Greek poetry. Now, that's not to say that they haven't been interested in Greek prose. A huge body of literature is on comparing the Gospels to Greek prose histories and biographies and so on. But poetry is more difficult. It's written centuries earlier than the Gospels. And so I think scholars feel that they're permitted to ignore it.
Thank you for that. How has Memetic or Mimesis criticism changed how you view the New Testament texts?
Oh, I think it's not only changed how I understand the texts, but it helps me understand who wrote these texts and the communities that they came from. We're not talking about popular literature that is simply naively mythological and they're grabbing for stories that are kind of in the air. These are written by intellectuals, not unlike Virgil, who are attempting to rewrite a script for their communities to locate them differently in the Roman Empire, because they're challenging the canonical texts of the Greeks, just the way that they are also contesting the canonical text of the Jews, namely the Septuagint. They also are changing the way we understand the readers of the Gospels. They are not simply peasants, lowlifes, and people who are not educated. They have enough education to appreciate these similarities between the Greek epics and the Gospels. And so that we have been dumbing down Greek readers of the Gospels too long, and we need to elevate them. Now, what happens then of the interpretation of the Gospels themselves, which is really Megan's question? It's that this is literature that is much more sophisticated than we've thought. And they're not trying to make historical claims. They're not trying to hoodwink their readers. They're trying to inspire their readers with an alternative mythology, and they're not ashamed of using art and narrative as a way of crafting that new identity.
Thank you. And she says, I'm sure that you've received some unfavorable responses from academics and lay people alike. What's the most common objection to your work and conclusions, and how do you counter it?
First of all, there are very few scholars who have directly counteracted my work. They're more likely to ignore it by just assuming that it's so outrageous that they don't have to deal with it. But the argument that they often give for ignoring it is that the gospel authors and their audiences were not sufficiently educated to be able to deduce these parallels and the significance of them. And that is then underscored by saying that the most obvious antitexts in the New Testament, and this I agree with, the most obvious antitexts in the New Testament come from Jewish scriptures. And these texts are engaging Jewish scriptures. But these gospels are cultural hybrids. They owe something to Judaism, but the Judaism they know is probably already Hellenized. But they also are living in a Greek world where the Homeric epics still have such cachet, again, as you can see with Virgil, even in Rome. So the biggest argument I have to give them, Megan, is to say, how do you explain the parallels? I'm not making them up. Let's put these texts together, and you tell me either they are not parallel, or you have another explanation for the parallels. And as far as I can tell, very few scholars have engaged me at that level. So the way to get around it is to be empirical, and to do it in Greek, and to pay attention to how this works. So I'm really angry at much of my discipline for ignoring it and to assume that these authors are feeble-minded and not educated. By the way, other scholars now are saying that the gospel authors are in fact educated, and that we can no longer assume that they are simply hoi polloi.
Thank you, Dennis. And then finally, what do you think is the most valuable thing that people can learn from your course, Dennis?
I think they can learn from the course that the New Testament is not divine revelation. It's human creativity. And so Jesus is not the Son of God revealed to humankind and giving the truth and their salvation only in Jesus. Rather, Jesus is an opportunity for these intellectuals to carve identities and do so mythologically. And we need to see it as a beautiful and often compelling human imaginative intellectual project, and not the inspiration of the Holy Spirit that requires everyone to believe in Jesus in order to have salvation.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate it. And thank you, Megan, for allowing me to host.